And welcome, everyone. I'm Janeska Romang, and I'm the Assistant Director of Advocacy and Communications at MPHA. Thank you for joining our conversation on housing, homelessness, and community-driven solutions. We are gathering at a pivotal juncture in our state. Massachusetts is now the second most expensive state in the country for cost of living and ranks 10th nationwide in rates of homelessness. Housing and homelessness, the crisis is unfolding amidst skyrocketing rents, the aftermath of the Supreme Court's grants pass decision, local camping bans, and the erosion of our state's right to shelter law. And right now, the connection between housing, homelessness, and health has never been clearer or more urgent. But often when we think about housing and homelessness, these issues are thought of in silos. But we know that the root causes are deeply interconnected, and so are their solutions, many of which already exist within our communities. So today's panel will explore the power of community-driven policy solutions and how organizations can remain accountable and responsive to community needs while navigating this rapidly changing landscape. We'll also explore how the incoming federal administration might impact state policy and what resistance looks like at both the local and state level. So over the next 50 minutes or so, our session will be kicked off by our panelists who will share more about their community and the work that they're leading, and then that'll be followed by a moderated discussion. So please be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar, and we'll try to address as many as we can throughout the panel. So now it's my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists, Carolyn Chou, the Executive Director of the Homes for All Massachusetts Coalition, Etel Haxhiaj, Worcester City Councilor and formerly of the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, Kelly Turley, the Associate Director at the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless, and Sharon Cho, the Director at Dudley Neighbors Inc. Thank you all for joining us today, and we're so excited to learn from you. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into the work y'all are leading. I'd like to start off first with Kelly. Could you tell us more about the coalition, the core of your work, and what drives your policy efforts in this space?
Thanks, Janeska, and it's great to be here. My name is Kelly Turley. I'm the Associate Director of Mass Coalition for the Homeless. The coalition is a statewide public policy and direct service organization founded back in 1981. We're based in Lynn, and our direct service work is partnering with families and unaccompanied adults who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. We mostly do a lot of our work now through community health centers and accountable care organizations, helping families and individuals apply for housing, apply for shelter, get connected to benefits, and to avoid homelessness. And on the policy side, our work is really focused on upstream homelessness prevention, increasing opportunities for long-term housing, and securing access to critical resources like shelter, which we see right now is really under attack here in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, as you know, I know we'll talk about a lot today, has a longstanding housing crisis, but right now we have a self-inflicted wound where we are also tearing away the fabric of the safety net where we have historically provided shelter to families and individuals in need, and we're seeing that fray in particular for families with children.
Thank you, Kelly, for sharing your insights into the coalition's advocacy efforts and how you're organizing in response to the dangerous changes to EA shelter. Now let's turn to Carolyn. Carolyn, can you tell us a little bit more about HFA and how the work is evolving to respond to the shifting housing landscape and the organizing efforts HFA is leading?
Yeah, so good to be here. Thanks, Janeska. So Homes for All Massachusetts, we're a statewide coalition of grassroots housing justice and tenant organizing groups, and we focus on ending displacement, gaining more community control of land, and ultimately housing that is for people, not for profit here in Massachusetts. And so we really come from bringing grassroots groups that are on the ground, working with tenants who are fighting to stay in their buildings, organizing to buy their buildings, are facing the brunt of the eviction and displacement and rising rent crisis across our state together to build our power as a statewide formation. So we're led by groups like City like Vida Urbana and New England Community Project in Boston, as well as Lynn United for Change in Lynn and Springfield, No One Leaves. And we have groups across the state, and we are building in more regions. I know with some of you all on this call as well, because we know we know that this is an issue across the state, and also we need to build our power at the grassroots across the state to move the kind of solutions and build the kind of power we need. So Homes for All has really been focused on that first part. How do we protect everyday people against displacement? And so for us on the policy front, that has been really working on rent stabilization and foreclosure prevention. But we see that as part of a bigger toolkit of housing policies that we need to work on. So we've been working more with Kelly and the Mass Coalition for the Homeless on ending homelessness, because we understand, you know, though our issues are often siloed, that housing and homelessness are, I mean, we know it when I say it, right? They're deeply connected, but in our advocacy and organizing, often tenants and unhoused people are pitted against each other. You know, at the State House, they're totally different conversations. And we're saying this is, you know, if our goal is homes for all, that's from someone who's living in a tent on the street to a tenant who's got their rent doubled, right, to a homeowner who is struggling to keep up with their mortgage payments, right? We all deserve to have housing, and for corporations to not be just buying up land. So I'll just say, you know, we really see our role as being the place to run statewide campaigns, bringing the strength of all of our grassroots groups who are on the ground, on our blocks, in our cities together, and also to help build a statewide movement and expand where folks are doing housing and tenant organizing, and to really make those connections and make sure that the response that's happening on the ground is connected to what we are building power for at the state level.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think your point around the interconnected solutions that we need to be pushing statewide and locally to build community power really resonates, especially in this moment. Now I'd like to hear from Etel. Could you introduce yourself, Etel, and share how Worcester is approaching some of these challenges at the local level?
Thank you, Janeska. And I just want to preface this by saying that I am completely re-inspired, recommitted, and just had chills all over by Reggie's amazing keynote. And also thank you to all of you for inviting the voice of elected officials. I am a city councilor in Worcester in my second term, but most of my work has been in community organizing, has been around homelessness, working in our family shelters, as well as with unhoused individuals. And most recently with the National Healthcare for the Policy Council, I helped author a brief on alternative solutions that communities can implement right now, such as temporary protected sites for folks experiencing homelessness, where service providers can go in and provide services without the threat of arrest. I feel like as an elected official, we are in a very unique position to use our power, our privilege, our platforms, whatever influence we have, soft and hard, to make sure that we're pushing back against things that we're seeing across the Commonwealth, camping bans, homeless sweeps, and without providing alternatives that are humane, that are compassionate, that are backed by data and a public health approach. In Worcester, we are seeing an uptick on unhoused, unsheltered individuals. But we are also seeing the invisible impact and the very visible impact that the Governor Healey's policies on shelter is going to have on families and children. Mostly, I have to say, women and children experiencing homelessness. This is going to devastate our communities of color. It's going to devastate our families. And as elected officials, we have, at least a few of us, have been trying really hard to partner with our Commissioner Castile, who's on the call here today, who I credit with leading the charge on the city of Worcester, but also with our partners on the ground. We are supporting our organizers who are looking at rent control petitions. We have authored a letter that is now up to hundreds of elected officials across the Commonwealth to pressure and to beg and to plead with Governor Healey to rescind the inhumane shelter policy that she and her administration have implemented. As I heard in Reggie's response, or a keynote, she talked a lot about power. And for elected officials, we are in the front lines. We are the first line of defense. But I have to say that community, our folks on the ground, the people have been doing this work with visibility and invisibility for decades, are the best line of defense. And the way that I am using my role, along with my colleagues and allies, is to make sure that we're speaking truth to power, that we are pushing back against policies, efforts, narratives that seek to demonize and harm our unhoused folks, and to be prepared really for mutual aid networks and community defense in light of the incoming administration. Again, going back to what Reggie said, and we really try to practice our values and do this with radical love, because people are looking to us to make sure that we are using every position of power and privilege to support those that have always needed our power and voice.
Thank you so much, Etel, for highlighting not only the role, but the responsibility of elected officials in pushing back against some of those really dangerous state level policies, and working with community to break down those silos across sector and speak in a unified voice to ensure that we are pushing policies that are rooted in community and compassion, and uphold the dignity of those who are unsheltered or unhoused, while we're also pushing for long-term solutions that get at the root of both our housing and homelessness crisis. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I just want to turn to Sharon. I'd love for you to share more about D&I, especially the housing justice initiatives that D&I has been leading over the past 35 years.
Thanks, Janeska. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sharon Cho, and I'm the director of the Dudley Neighbors Incorporated Community Land Trust. And we're the community land trust that was founded by our parent organization, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And we're based in the Roxbury and North Dorchester neighborhoods of Boston. And we were really founded by our community during a time of deep disinvestment in this area of Boston. And in fact, the Dudley neighborhood, when we started in the late 80s, was one of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston. And, it was an area that really no one wanted to come to or invest in, right? There was no real estate speculator or investor or developer who wanted to build in this neighborhood. And, much of that is due to historic and systemic patterns of disinvestment, right? That we've seen in many communities, not just in Boston, but in communities in Massachusetts and across the state as well. And we were really founded in response to, the city initiating a planning process for revitalization for our neighborhood. And people had seen the patterns of gentrification, right? And what happens when, planning is made for people without including the people who are impacted. And so DS&I was formed as a coalition of residents, of nonprofits, of religious organizations who said, hey, if you are going to be making decisions about our community, you have to have community at the table. And so, just to share a little bit about one of our stories, I heard a lot about, the power of organizing that our keynote Reggie shared earlier, and, that really resonates, right? Our community, which consists primarily of immigrants, people of color, working class folks, organize to gain control over swaths of vacant parcels in our community. And it was through organizing, people power of this working class community, that they were able to gain the power of eminent domain. So the power for a private entity, which has been used typically by government to take private land for public use. And we know the harms of eminent domain. and the history of urban renewal. And our community had another imagination, a vision around what if we had this power? And so, through organizing, we were able to gain control, the community gained control over 30 acres of vacant parcels in Roxbury and Dorchester. And with regards to a community land trust, our strategy for housing justice and community control is by decommodifying land. That means that land that is in our community land trust will never be sold for profit, but it is intended to serve the priorities and the needs of the community that has been determined by the community. And so today on our land trust, we have, over 200 units of permanently affordable housing and, and open space and gardens and affordable commercial space as well. And what we're working on today really is continuing to implement the community's vision of what we want to see in a vibrant, diverse, and high quality neighborhood. We're continuing to realize that vision through our community land trust. And, on the state level, we've been collectively advocating for policies to advance housing for people and not for profit, right? One of the policies that we've been really pushing for is the Small Properties Acquisition Fund, which in short, it would allow community land trusts and nonprofits to purchase housing that that landlords are trying to sell, right? So these are the homes that many of our members live in today, and really is in response to just the patterns of speculation where the homes that our members are living in are being purchased and flipped by investors. And we're also collectively amongst many of our land trust members, pushing for support and resources to build and preserve affordable housing that is permanent as well.
Thank you, Sharon, for sharing that powerful example of what is possible when we work with community to reclaim that power and drive the solutions and do that visioning together with community. I think one of the threads that everyone has kind of touched on is the power of organizing to build community power and shift decision-making back to communities that have historically been kind of left out of the decision-making processes that impact their lives, their neighborhoods, and their livelihood. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the principles that guide your work, and maybe I can kick it off with Etel and Sharon. What frameworks do you use to really meaningfully engage with community members and ensure that community members are their input, their feedback is helping to shape the organizing work and the policy work going forward?
Thank you, Janeska. It's a really good question. And, just thinking about what Sharon just said in terms of the power of community organizing. And, I bring that framework and experience a lot in my work as an elected official, even though I'm in a different role now. But I have found through my experience governing that I think that we can never, those of us who are in elected office can never separate ourselves from the folks that we know best. They know best than us. And for me, what that means, at least for me, is making sure that I'm constantly keeping myself grounded in the work that's happening on the ground. I want to give a shout out to the Worcester Affordable Housing Coalition, who has been trying really for over 2 years now, when we first co-founded, when the ARPA dollars were announced, to make sure that the community had a voice and not just a seat at the table, but that they actually had authentic decision-making power. And that doesn't come easy. City halls are known to be very resistant to what they perceive as outside influence and power. And I think what I have found is that we still have a ton of work to do to make sure that those principles of community organizing, listening, and making sure that we're not thinking that we have the solutions as elected officials, guide the work, and that we orient other people who are aspiring to follow this line of work to do the same. One other thing that I have found that, at least for Worcester, has helped us move some things forward is that we have, those of us who are in elected office have a unique opportunity and influence to just break doors, to break walls, to break and expand tables, to break doors that prevent people from accessing those tables, and make sure that we're not just building bigger tables, as one of my favorite people has said, but make sure that we are bringing our own chairs, right? That the community has an authentic space in there. And that doesn't come easily, but whenever we have the opportunity to do that, it's important. I'll end with this. I think that right now, especially in light of the governor's policy, with regards to decimating shelter, the right to shelter, those of us actually who have been engaged in this work have made an intentional effort to learn from people like Kelly Turley and Carolyn and Sharon and others, Andrea Park, and other organizations on the ground who have been leading the work. I think that it's important for elected officials especially to approach this work with a lot of humility and to follow the lead of both our families and our constituents on the ground, but most importantly, the organizers in the trenches that are telling us what they need from us. I mean, I always feel like I am in a place of service, and I take that very, very seriously. And I think that the incoming Trump administration is going to target communities like Worcester, both because we are a resettlement community and because we have large numbers of unhoused folks. And so I feel like those principles of organizing that have created some change in our communities and pockets of resistance need to get stronger, and we need to be right there with our community members, shoulder to shoulder.
And, I'll also share that, one of our organizing principles, so DS&I has a list of organizing principles, and, one of them is nothing happens without community process. Everything happens because of it. And I think that principle really underscores the importance of process in all of our decision making. And so, I think that's a framework that we're always bringing it into our work. And I'll just share, one example of, what that looks like, in our community. And so we have an agreement with the city of Boston that for our neighborhood, any public parcel, so any city-owned parcel, the city must come to us. And it's our community that actually decides what happens on that public land. And that again, just to go back, earlier, that power would never have been bestowed to us without advocacy and organizing. And so every public parcel in our neighborhood, it is residents who get to determine the land use of it, whether that is affordable housing, affordable rental, a park, commercial space. It's the people who get to decide. And the community land trust, and that parcel is then conveyed to the community land trust, which is stewarded by really residents, by we have a board that is representative of our community. And so the intention is that all of these public, formerly public parcels are stewarded in service of what the needs of our community are. And so, I think that at every step of the way, having community members' voice at the table is really at the heart of our work. And that is both on the neighborhood level, as well as the city and the state level as well. And I think that we at DSNI and DNI, it's often easy to feel like that organization is the staff and the leadership. But I think for us that we really see ourselves, it is our members, it is our residents that is DSNI and DNI, right? And I think another really profound principle that I think has really guided our vision is the idea that anything is possible, right? And I think that just going back to the story around how we were able to gain eminent domain power, so that's an example that it's actually, we were the first community to be able to gain eminent domain control. And I think for a community that had been so disinvested, to have that kind of power, I think no one thought that was possible. And so I think having that kind of big vision of what it is that our people deserve, right? And thinking about what are the big solutions that we want and can get to address the needs of our community.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Etel. I appreciate you both sharing your perspectives and really touching on the importance of humility, entering every space with humility and deep listening, and also the bold visioning piece. I think oftentimes in the policy space, we hear what is winnable, right? And we need to be more and more pushing on bold policies so that we can win structural change and shift that power back to community. And your example of eminent domain is a really powerful example of what it looks like to continue pushing and have that bold vision. So I appreciate you both sharing those examples and your perspectives. And Kelly and Carolyn, thinking about some of the state level organizing, how do these approaches translate to the statewide context? And where do you see any key differences, if any?
You want to jump in, Kelly? I think, at its for Homes for All, at the fundamental, it's what Etel and Sharon said, right? It's just how do you bring these different communities that exist in different housing conditions, right? That have different racial and ethnic communities, though, I mean, all of our groups are BIPOC, Black and Brown led, but all of our cities have different immigrant communities, right? There's just different dynamics in any place. How do you bring that together and stay grounded in the grassroots, but also come up with a shared vision? And that, to go back to something I think someone asked Reggie a question about, right? It is about building trust, and it's about the long, hard, slow work of working together. I think we build trust both by talking, but also by doing things together, right? I think groups like Homes for All groups build trust by defending buildings together, by running actions, but as well as by debating policy and bringing members together, all those things, right? Over time, you build that trust. And so, for us, it's really being grounded in the grassroots, being grounded at what's happening on people's blocks, but those things might be different. So it's also about bringing those together, building the trust to say, okay, this is how we make decisions together that is grounded not just in one person's opinion from each organization, but in our bases, in the people each organization is accountable to. And then how do we come together and come up with solutions that we all feel good about, and we wrestle through those details to come up with, things like policies we're going to put forward or strategies around how we want to support building more organizing in the state or whatever it may be. But I think, housing organizing is hard because there's no one solution, right? There are many crises coming together. I think it's even representative on this panel, and that means there are many solutions. And I think to what Sharon was saying, right? And what you were saying, Janeska, about how we're often asked what is winnable, I think we have to just continue to hold that there are many solutions. And what we actually are putting forward is a different vision of how housing exists within our society, right? And that's big and long-term and lofty to say we want to change the system so housing's for people, not for profit. But it means there's many things that come down from that. And we focus on the things that resonate with our bases that are going to impact their lives right now, but with that long-term vision. So it's always that balance of defending what we have, pushing for the immediate solutions, but really having to hold that vision and building that collectively. And I'll just say, in everything we do, from our organizations to then the coalition, we really value, that the people most impacted have to lead in the decision making. And I think, to your question, Janeska, may be relevant to some folks here, right? As you get a little further removed from the day-to-day work with the base, with the members of your organizations, it is hard, right? You're in these rooms, you're being asked to cut a deal, to make a decision, to do whatever, right? And so it takes trust and discipline to be grounded in that the people most impacted, that we do have to sometimes say, and this doesn't jive with like the State House, that we do have to go back to our community. We do have to take this back. We aren't making this decision right now, right? Because for us, it's not just about winning now, it's about winning now and winning in the long term. And we have to hold that. And it's hard because there's so much we have to defend. I mean, I wonder I think, Janeska, you might ask, but I know we've been talking about the shelter policy, but for Kelly to break down a little more, because not only right now are we trying to win what can feel like crumbs, and we know that folks' lives are at stake here, but also, we feel like we're losing some of what we have. And I know we're going to talk about the Trump administration, but as we move forward, we have to, in a state like Massachusetts, be saying we actually can't constrict. We have to be bold. We have to defend what we have, and we can push for more, even in conditions that feel like that are going to feel even harder.
Yeah, and I can jump in. I think so much of the organizing work that we're doing to uphold housing as a human right and protect the right to shelter, and to make sure that we're recognizing the basic humanity of people who may be experiencing housing instability and homelessness, is really at the core of the work, and trying to make those connections across various levels. So people who may never have experienced housing instability, to make sure that they understand how critical it is that Massachusetts has provided basic resources, has a long history of doing that, and that we need to continue to do that, whoever's in the White House, whoever is in the governor's seat. And I think that sometimes, it gets more challenging because the folks that are looked to for solutions have contracts with the state. They want to have access to power, so they're not willing to call out the injustice, to call out the hypocrisy, to call out the policies that we're implementing that clearly don't make sense. If you talked to someone and said, does it make sense that we're going to tell families they can only get 30 days in a barrack style shelter and then expect them to be able to, find housing at the end of it? That doesn't make sense when we've gone from a system where families were able to access the shelter that they needed until they could secure housing. We're not taking into account what the larger housing market is, how long it takes for the state to, provide the resources to families to help them with down payment and first month's rent, last month's rent, et cetera. But we're really we're at a place now where we're setting families up for failure. And so being able to name that for what it is really critical. I think another key piece is that so much of what's happening in terms of housing policy is that the general public thinks that, well, Massachusetts, sure, we're taking care of people, like that's what we've always done. So much of it is under the radar, and we're the state is making policy and sending out press releases that, unless you really know the details, it sounds like it's okay. Even in our circles, like, oh wait, is that something that's good or not? And so bringing it back and talking to families who are directly experiencing housing instability and homelessness, who've been through the system, but also with the providers and grassroots advocates in the communities to talk about what are the changes that are being proposed? What do they mean? How can we demystify it? And so that we can get the broader public engaged and stay focused and push back against the, we're seeing the right to shelter dissolve. And how do we push back against that and make sure that we're not just protecting what we've already had, but building that better future, which we know that we can do, because Massachusetts is one of the, if not the richest state in the country, that we have resources that, other states really envy, and that we have, if we can combine that with the political will to really honor that right to housing and that right to shelter, it's so critical. But we know that that is possible because we have community groups that are invested, we have faith communities, and we have lawmakers and elected officials like Etel and others who want to do the right thing and be engaged. But that it does require not only us recognizing the humanity of the lawmakers and the decision makers, but them also recognize our humanity and the basic needs that people have. We're talking about, children and families who are sleeping in cars and in campgrounds and places not meant for human habitation. We're talking about unaccompanied adults who tonight and, throughout the winter will be in, emergency rooms or cars. That this is something that doesn't have to exist in Massachusetts. So we can simultaneously provide that right to shelter, but also ensure that we're building that network to make sure that housing is decommodified and that people have access to safe permanent housing. And so some of it is putting that vision out there and showing lawmakers and decision makers that it's not only the right thing to do, but it's something that we have to do. And it's, so much of the conversation is about money, and we know, trying to convince them as well, that by not meeting people's basic needs, the healthcare costs, the educational costs, the job losses, and the loss of our own humanity, but that's really critical to do. So being able to make those connections across communities, across the state. And we know that homelessness plays out differently in urban areas, rural areas, suburban areas, and, depending on the region, but that everywhere that Massachusetts is facing this housing crisis, and that together we can chart this, a better path forward. But it does require centering those closest to it, as been said in this panel, and making sure that we're really engaging with communities and with families and individuals who've been on the front lines experiencing homelessness. And that's a lot of our call right now, is that as policies are being made in a vacuum, that policymakers step back and really listen, because that's something that's missing right now. And so we're hopeful that in the months ahead, that Massachusetts the legislators and the governor, when they're organizing to push back against the Trump administration, that they're also recognizing how they are been complicit in perpetuating housing instability and homelessness. So we remain hopeful.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Carolyn, for highlighting what it looks like to unite the pockets of resistance across our state, and to push solutions and alternatives to the current policy changes that are being made to EA shelter, on the housing policy landscape, and what it looks like to hold our administration to account, to ensure that we are pushing a bolder vision and bolder solutions that really support the humanity and dignity of those who are experiencing housing instability, and are unsheltered. I think one of the themes that came up in all responses was around accountability. I think accountability, both holding our elected officials accountable and being accountable to community, is kind of at the core of the work. And I'd love to hear from each of you what that looks like in practice. So maybe I can start with Sharon, and then we'll move on to Etel, Carolyn, and then Kelly.
I would say community accountability and community representation is, it's really baked into our even organizational governance structure. And, I think that's one of the ways that, we're taking a value and operationalizing it, right? And what that looks like is that our bosses, our board of directors of our organization are folks who live in the community. And so in order to serve on our board of directors, one has to live, work, or worship within our communities. So, our members, our residents, they are our, ultimate stakeholders. And, I think just the question, but the question around also accountability of our electeds, I think, we are really, our work is really to, advocate and push those who are in positions of power, that they are using and serving, our residents, right? And so, that our founding is really based on that premise, right? That, the city and, the mayor of Boston, the former redevelopment authority, that they were really not accountable to our community, right? And the way that we keep those in power accountable is really by building community power, right? And organizing, and to say these are not just one-off voices of single, individuals, but this is an entire community, right? That is demanding that, we need resources, right? We need healthy homes and healthy streets, right? And so, I think, accountability on, to our stakeholders as our community, as well as, I think, how we hold our elected officials and those in power accountable. It's a really important piece of our work too.
So, I'm held accountable every 2 years at the ballot box. But I think that I take the accountability of my role in sort of a different way. And I think a lot about, when I used to work for Central Mass Housing Alliance, and right above my office, I could hear the little feet of the kids, or they would, a mom and her child would greet me in the morning, and 5 o'clock, I had to go back to city council and then listen and sit for hours and hours. I'm exaggerating, but what it feels like hours and hours of testimony why we can't have a shelter, why we can't have an affordable housing, why this elected official seems to only care about those people, and why isn't she accountable to us and more so than them? And this division of us versus them, and what the role of those of us that have that chosen that path of service through public service, at least I take it very seriously, in the sense that my accountability at the end of the day is the people who have traditionally, historically, for decades just been pushed to the margins, and who I see are going to get pushed more to the margins. And so I'm accountable to that. I'm accountable to that urgency, that if I am in this position of power at this day and time, that my community needs me, and that I need to resist any instinct of looking to how this is going to affect me next election. Because guess what? If I am held accountable by people who don't like my policies, or don't like me to be practicing governance in a humane and inclusive way, I can be voted out of office, but I will not be voted out of doing this work as a non-elected official with my, siblings out in the community. And so I think that those of us who are at this moment in time are choosing the path of elected office need to think really, really hard about what accountability looks like. For me, it means, if you are in rooms where people tell you not share this conversation with community, like Carolyn was saying, try to negotiate between that person and that group and that group. It's making a conscious choice to say, no, we're not going to have this kind of status behind the scenes conversations. We're not going to negotiate on the backs of our community members, and just staying true to that commitment, and also learning how to be strategic. And for me, what that means is being accountable to people who are suffering the most, and making sure that the groups that are needing access to local governance have access to local governance. I could say more, but I think I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Etel. Maybe I can turn it over to Carolyn or Kelly to jump in with your thoughts and perspective.
Sure, I can jump in. I think so much of the work around housing and homelessness issues really is centered on accountability, because at the end of the day, if we don't do our job, people are without the most basic of human needs. And so we, feel that deep accountability to the community, to folks who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness, because the stakes are so high, and trying to be able to convey that to lawmakers when they are saying, well, we have to balance the budget somewhere. And it's like, but not on the backs of people experiencing housing instability and homelessness. A key piece that we keep talking about is the state has the largest rainy day fund ever. And the state gave $1 billion in tax breaks to, upper income people. And at the same time, the state is saying, well, we can't spend money to be able to provide basic shelter and services to children for the amount of time that they need to stabilize. And so being able to call that out and to keep pushing on lawmakers to come to the table in good faith and to have that dialogue, and to call them out when that's not happening. As I said before, so much of what is happening on housing and homelessness issues is done through press releases that sound good, or that there's sound bites, or there is that pitting of one community against the other. Like, we can't provide for our veterans if we're providing for newly arrived immigrant families, or other false choices that are set up. And so I think being accountable, making sure that we are calling out the misinformation, and not only holding ourselves accountable, but also the decision makers who really, with the combination of political will and the funds that exist in the Massachusetts budget, really could significantly end homelessness and housing instability here.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add, I mean, just echoing what folks have said, but just building off something Etel said, I think we really do, to be accountable to the community, we really do need to bring the margins to the center. So often we're, like Sharon was saying, we're told like, oh, this is just one person's voice, or this is kind of like, most people are, this helps most people, but like maybe these people, there's issue. And that's generally not true. It's just an excuse, right? And so I think we have an obligation, like, we understand intersectionality, right? We understand that, like, Black and brown communities, immigrants, women, LGBTQ communities, right, like, often are disproportionately impacted, almost always are disproportionately impacted by these issues. And often, like, the experience of, trans young people trying to find housing is seen as like, oh, that's kind of to the side of the main, as an example, right? There's many of those. And and I think we have obligation to say, like, when we fight for people who are most at the margins, we are improving things for all of us. And we have to resist as Kelly said, the pitting against each other, and resist this kind of this kind of like, well, we can't address everyone's issues kind of mentality, right? Because what we're grounded in is the community we're accountable to. And that community includes whatever populations those are. It could be, recently arrived immigrants, trans young people. I mean, this is a huge group, but mothers with children, right? Like, seniors, like we can't say, oh, we can't deal with this side issue these folks are having. We have to say, when we bring the margins to the center, that we are making the best policy decisions, and those are the people we're accountable to going back to as community advocates.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and really highlighting the importance of accountability and what that looks like in practice at the local level, the state level, and how we can continue to envision together for a bold structural change to win housing justice, community control of land, and ensure that we decommodify housing and ensure the dignity and rights of all people in Massachusetts. And I think back to an example from COVID, right? When we organized across across sectors to push for one of the strongest eviction and foreclosure moratoriums in the country. And I think that that is a powerful example that shows what is possible when we continue to fight in a unified voice, fight across sectors, and amplify the asks and experiences of those on the ground. I wish that we had another hour to talk together, but it looks like we're coming up on time. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for sharing your time and your expertise with us. Really grateful to you all and all the hard work that you're leading locally and statewide. Thank you again.